Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of Money Talk with Skylar Fleming. I'm going to be talking about managing student loans while you're in school. And this is really going to be an episode of personal experience because Rebecca is currently in PA school. And we're going to talk about how you manage student loans while you're in school, both things like unsubsidized and subsidized loans, undergrad and graduate loans. How do you manage all that while you're actively in school? And it's really something. You got to make sure you're paying attention. You can't just put it off until the very end. And you have to make sure you're aware of how much loans you have. There's going to be a whole host of things that we're going to talk about today. But the money talking points for today's episode are, what do you do with your student loans while you're in school? And second, how can I build a plan for my student loans? So with that, let's get right into today's episode. You know, we don't talk about money enough. It's a topic that gets ignored for some reason, even though it plays a role in everyone's day-to-day life. Well, this issue is what brought Money Talk with Skylar Fleming to reality. I know you're probably busy and don't have time to research and learn about all the things that go into personal finance, but that's where this podcast, Money Talk, comes into play. I'm your host, Skylar Fleming, and I'm here to do the research and learn all the extra stuff about personal finance for you. The goal is to simply get us talking about money, so let's get talking. All right, let's start out by just defining this episode. Guess what? Student loans are a big deal. They plague a lot of people. They're a big deal on a lot of people's minds. It's very likely you know someone who's being struggling with student loans or they're impacting their lives. Student loans can be debilitating. They can be something that just weighs down on you and makes it so that you're never really able to take full advantage of your college education that you work so hard for. Plus, they can drain your financial life. You can find yourself having no money for other things. Like, how do you have fun in your life when your student loan payments are through the roof and you can't really find a job that works with your degree and you're not making as much money as the colleges told you would? So there's a lot that can come from student loans. And I don't want to get into all of the specifics about what student loans do or don't do and cause or don't cause. But I'm just going to talk about how you handle them while you're in school and maybe some tips and advice for people going through college and how in this episode you can look at it going forward, but think about your student loans while you're actually in school. There's a huge impact that this can potentially have, and let's talk about that next. All right, like I said, the impact is huge. And you need to have a plan. Having a plan is a big deal. Having a plan of how you're going to handle student loans, how much debt you're willing to take on, and making sure you know the overall cost of your college education. No plan is huge as well, but in the wrong way. You're going to be going in the wrong direction if you don't really understand what you're doing when it comes to managing debt, which can be one of the harmful things of student loans is that so many people are so young, have never had any experience in managing debt, and then you have to go on and take on large amounts of debt for this promised education and promised financial prosperity that comes with a college education, which may not always be the case, which is why you got to make sure you have a plan. And if it's overwhelming, you're unsure, you don't really know how to manage debt, there's honestly an abundance of different financial resources online. Take your question and ask it to multiple different forums. Ask it on places like Reddit. Ask it on different Facebook groups. There's a ton of podcasts out there that will cover this topic. Some of the ones to name off of the top of my head that'll do like Q&A stuff are like The Money Guy Show, How to Money, Stacking Benjamins. All of those will cover these kind of things. They'll have people on. They've had episodes in the past. I've had episodes in the past. And that's what this episode is to help you get an understanding a little bit of how to manage student loan debt. But make sure you have a plan. Student loans are fine. There's a way to handle them and a way to take care of them. But too many of them with no plan is not fine. It can be overwhelming, stressful, and then you'll feel like you really got screwed with your education because you're now saddled with all this debt and you're never going to actually be able to work a job that makes enough to get out from under the burden of capitalizing interest where it keeps growing and growing on itself and working entirely against you. There's a lot of crazy things that student loans can do to harm your financial life. But let's talk about how do you actually deal with them? How do you build a plan? How do you implement the plan of dealing with your student loans while in school? Let's talk about that next. Well, the first step is just to start asking questions and then start researching options. Listen to a bunch of podcasts about student loans. Go in your favorite podcast player and just search the word student loans or college debt or college education and just start listening to stuff. And then write down those key things that stand out to you that you want to learn more about that you aren't really sure about. And then just start researching options. Ask friends about it. It's important to ask people for their opinion. Someone else in your life may have gone through a very similar situation and had student loans, and they can give their input on whether they were valuable, whether they're not, how they handled it. Build a plan by just researching some options and figure out your best foot to put forward, because you may not know, and it's very unlikely that you're going to know the absolute perfect way to execute your plan for dealing with your student loans. But if you just get started and start researching options and put together something, it's going to be way better than nothing, because your best plan is what is the best way that you go forward with the knowledge that you have, because you don't know what you don't know. And that's okay. Just keep researching options, build the plan, and then go from there. One important thing too is to figure out your stance on student loans and work from there. If you don't want them at all, that's okay. Figure out what you got to do to accomplish that. Maybe it's setting up a rigorous system to apply for an insane amount of scholarships to make sure you can pay for college. Maybe it's working for 3 or 4 years before you go to college so that you have the money you need, and then you have the time you need to maybe take more classes than normal so that you can get your degree done quicker, but have the cost savings of taking more credits than normal with the money that you saved up by working the time instead of going to college and working. See, there's a lot of ways you can play this. Make sure you're talking to people. If anyone has any feedback or questions about maybe a good way to handle student loans or a good way to handle paying for college, please reach out to me. I'd love to chat about it, have you on a podcast episode, anything like that. But make sure you're signed up for your online account with your student loan servicer. That way, you know how much debt you have, you know your balance, you know payoff dates and things like that, you know your interest rates, and that you're actually aware of how much debt you have. That's extremely important, because I think so often college students can find themselves in a place where you check a box. It's just like every other terms and agreements that you've ever checked and never read, except this one at college is very important and can be quite costly to your financial life. So make sure you at least know how much debt you have with your student loans. Make sure you know how much you're signing up for and how things like Pell Grants and the FAFSA and those things play a role, because the FAFSA is easily the most important thing you can fill out in terms of your college financial situation. But I want to talk about the money talking points next. How do you have a conversation around this topic, and what are some of my thoughts on the money talking points? All right, the first money talking point is, what do you do with your student loans while you're in school? I think this is a great one to have, especially if you're a brand new college student going to school for the first time. You've never dealt with student loans. You've never really dealt with debt at all. Have this conversation with your parents. Have this conversation with maybe one of the financial counselors that the school offers. That can be a tricky one though. Heads up about using financial counselors at the school. They may be bought into a system that feeds you in the direction of taking loans when they may not be the best for your financial situation. So make sure you're getting outside third-party opinions as well, whether it's asking in online forums to get an abundance of responses to find maybe your path that you want to go down. But a couple things that I know is that, what do you do with your student loans while you're in school? Well, usually you don't have to make payments. And those payments get deferred until you graduate, usually about 6 months after, I believe. And interest is usually deferred on most undergraduate loans. There are caps, I believe, on subsidized loans, which is what those are called. But subsidized loans are where the government apparently pays the interest on your loan while you're in school, I believe. It's been a while since I've done some research on subsidized loans, because Rebecca and I are currently dealing with a lot of graduate loans, which are just unsubsidized loans. And then once you get to a certain threshold, there's what's called grad plus loans. Those suck. We're working very hard to avoid grad plus loans in particular, but unsubsidized loans, you have to pay the interest, and the interest accrues on them. But you also got to be aware of maybe what's the current environment federally and on the government level around student loans, because right now at the time of recording this, student loan interest is still paused, which is awesome for us dealing with our interest on our student loans. But it's also something we got to be aware of whenever that student loan interest continues and restarts. But also, what if we do manage to get $10,000 forgiven of our student loans? That'll be quite nice, regardless of my stance on the issue. getting $10,000 forgiven will be nice towards the balance of our loans as a whole. So there's a lot of things to consider. You got to figure out what you want to do with them after school. So make sure if you want to pay them off as quickly as possible, go ahead, build a plan around that. But what if you want to maybe do something where you invest the difference of the extra payment you're trying to pay? Because maybe your student loans have a really low interest rate right now, and you'd rather invest and save that money. Then one strategy I would say is very plausible. Make sure you're making the minimum payment. Of course, you don't want to be late on your student loans and deal with that. Make sure you're making the minimum payment, and then anything extra you would pay. So let's say your minimum payment's $100 for the sake of this example, and you're like, I've looked at my budget. I can do $200 a month towards this student loan, but it's such a low interest rate. And I've heard online that maybe it's bad to pay down low interest debt super fast when I'm young. Everyone talks about investing and that I need to get started with like an IRA or just a regular investment account to allow my money to grow faster with the stock market. Okay, here's one strategy. Minimum payment, $100. You have $200 to pay. Make sure you're making the $100 minimum payment, and then open up just a regular taxable account that you can sell at any time and put the extra payment into that account. That way, that money can grow over the long term because you probably have quite a while to pay back your student loans. That money can grow over the long term, and then eventually you're going to hit a point where you're able to be debt free, but you don't necessarily need to be. But if worse comes to worse and you need to get rid of that student loan in a few days, you can sell your stocks, transfer the money over to your loan provider, and pay them off, which is a really nice place to be in, because then you can just leave the money in the stock market to continue to grow, keep making your minimum payment. And then that money that's in the stock market that would have been your extra payment is now well over making you what your interest rate would have cost to pay that down quicker. So it can be a way to kind of invest the difference and make more money in the stock market by kind of, I don't want to call it gaming the system because that makes it sound a little fishy, but you're kind of making sure to play your cards right so that you're making more money than what you're paying down the loan with the extra money. So, second money talking point. How can I build a plan to pay off my student loans? Well, start with your balance and then start with your different interest rates and then identify your payoff method. Do you want to just do the snowball method? Do you want to do the avalanche method? The snowball method is where you're paying down the lowest balance to the biggest balance regardless of interest rate. And the avalanche method is where you're paying down the largest interest rate to the smallest interest rate, which is mathematically the more optimal solution. But the snowball method can be the best behaviorally because the snowball method gets you excited because you're seeing those little tiny loans get paid off very quickly. Those couple $1,000s are gone. You're getting hyped. You're getting pumped up. The avalanche one, you're saying, oh yeah, I'm saving this much money in interest, but it can be a bit of a slog right at the beginning where you're just going through it with one of your massive student loans that has a high interest rate. So honestly, I think a good approach is a balance. Identify a point where you consider your student loans to be high balance, or really this can work with any debt, but identify a point where you consider it to be a high balance. Take everything below that and do the snowball method with those ones first to build yourself the momentum that you need to emotionally and to build the behaviors that you need to pay off this much debt. If you have a ton of debt, this is just a general debt payoff strategy. So start with a snowball method with a couple of your really low debt options, or what kind of debt you might have. Start with the snowball method on the really small ones. And then once you build that momentum and build those behaviors and they're ingrained in you to pay off your debt, then go for the avalanche method and save the money on that interest and pay down the one with the biggest interest rate and just go at it that way. That way you can get the momentum and get the behaviors down at the beginning and get the emotional gain from the snowball method. And then you can start rolling downhill even faster with the avalanche method. But like I mentioned, there's also the minimum payments with investing the extra. I mentioned that previously, so I'm not going to go over that all again. But build out the plan and stick to it aggressively. If you have a plan in place that works, then who cares how long it takes you to pay them off? If you build a plan and stick to it, it's okay, whatever you do. Because if you're doing this much research, if you're at the point where you're listening to multiple podcasts, you're trying to build out an extensive plan about what you want to do with your personal finance, then you're going to be just fine. You're going to likely be in a good place with your loans where they won't harm your financial life because you won't let them, because you're going to be doing an extensive enough of a plan to make it work. So build your plan and stick to it aggressively. But let's wrap up today's episode next. I hope you learned something from today's episode, but I want to summarize it all real quick for you. All right, so Rebecca and I, we do have a plan in place for her student loans. So make sure you have one for your own. It doesn't have to be intense, doesn't have to be crazy. You don't have to be living on ramen noodles for the rest of your life until they're paid off. But be aware of your balances and be aware of your interest rates. It's a great place to start. Just get an idea, really, of how much debt you actually have and how much interest you're paying on your student loans. But please consider sharing this episode with someone who you know has student loan debt. If you have any questions about how to build a debt payoff plan, please send me an email and I'd be happy to help. Also, feel free to comment on my blog posts, my social media posts, anywhere you find me. I'd be happy to help. But thank you for listening to Money Talk with Skylar Fleming. I'm your host, Skylar Fleming. Have a great week.
Thank you for listening to Money Talk. The Money Talk show is provided for informational and entertainment purposes and should not be used for personal or specific financial advice. Every situation is unique and different. Please make sure to do your own research for your personal financial situation.